Something that I often hear said about Flesh and Blood is that while it's done an incredible job at capturing competitive players, it doesn't do well with casuals. People tend to cite their local game stores where new players show up with their casual decks, get stomped due to the difficult nature of the game, and tend not to show up again. It's also commonly said that casual players are the backbone to any trading card game, since it's a much wider audience, and so if Flesh and Blood doesn't pick up the slack in this department, then they're going to struggle to grow and could very well land on the ever-growing list of dead TCGs. Now, there is one big issue to this sentiment. We don't know if Flesh and Blood actually struggles to gain casual players. The reality is that most casual players aren't going to the LGS and they aren't going online to talk about the game, since they don't engage nearly as much as myself or probably most of you. Most casual players are just that. Casual. They buy some product, play it at home with their friends, and that's that. So when people look to things like their shrinking LGS numbers, it's not exactly a good metric to gauge how many casual players there are. However, for the sake of this video, let's say that this argument is true. The more competitive nature of the game is keeping casuals out of the LGS, and because of that, Flesh and Blood's longevity is uncertain. I've heard this said often enough that it's made me want to tackle it head on, because even if true, not being as appealing to casual players is not a guaranteed death sentence. And to demonstrate this, I want to turn to one of my all-time favorite video game franchises, but before I get into this topic, I'd like to thank the sponsor of this video, Into the AM. If you're a fan of Flesh and Blood, then you probably like the things you own to be of high quality. So why stop at just trading cards when you can also have beautiful, high quality clothing? Into the AM is a premium apparel company run by a team of artists and creators who view clothing as the canvas to express what drives you. Or in simpler terms, they make these incredibly gorgeous graphic tees. Ranging from vibrant bright colors to earthy warm tones, there's a myriad of beautiful shirts to choose from. But what's that? Graphic tees not your style? Well, that's fine, because they've also got basic branded and non-branded tees, polos, flannels, hoodies, underwear, which I am currently wearing, and no, I'm not showing you. I'm gonna be very real. I was actually really blown away with just how nice Into the AM's clothing is. These shirts are super comfortable and have become my favorites to wear. Like, you know how after you do laundry and there's always a couple shirts you wear before all the others? That's these now. So huge thank you to Into the AM for sponsoring this video. If you want to get some gorgeous clothing to go with those gorgeous Flesh and Blood cards, use my link in the description or the pinned comment below, intotheam.com/sloopdoop, to get 10% off your entire order. Thank you very much. Back to the video. So to get this out of the way, I am very well aware that these games are in two wildly different ballparks. Flesh and Blood is a trading card game based off fighting games, and Monster Hunter is an action RPG video game series. However, the one binding factor is that both these games have historically been rather difficult to get into. As we already know, Flesh and Blood is a competitive TCG first and foremost, and while it's super easy to pick up a blitz deck or a round the table set and learn the rules, it's a very challenging game to get good at. Learning how to block effectively, use armor properly, set up power turns, pivot the tempo of a game, grind your way out of a tight spot on low life total, pitch stack, learn the nuances of your own deck and how it works against the opponent's strategy. There's a lot to learn in this game that goes far deeper than the initial experience might suggest. I'm fairly certain that, yes, every new player who has gone to their LGS has had the experience of showing up and getting absolutely destroyed. Flesh and Blood is a low variance, high skill game, meaning better players are going to win an overwhelming majority of the time. And in order to get good, it's going to demand hundreds of hours and a lot of patience, because you'll have to get very used to losing. So while it's super easy to start playing the game, it can be very hard for a lot of people to continue to play it long enough to gain the skills for them to win more frequently at even the local level. And believe it or not, Monster Hunter also used to be very difficult to get into. Up until Monster Hunter World, the older games, also known as old school Monster Hunter, were very challenging to newcomers. See, back in the day, Monster Hunter games were not only incredibly difficult, but also very deliberate and slow. From the combat to gathering items, grinding for drops, using paintballs to track monsters, and doing urgent quests that had to be done once for every person in your group, things used to be a bit of a slog. Now, that's not to say these games were bad, far from it. Despite how slow things could be, the fights themselves were super fun and challenging. Not only did you have to master your own weapon, you also had to memorize and understand all of the monsters' attack patterns, otherwise you'd likely get steamrolled. These were games that weren't played for 30 to 40 hours, beaten and then put down. These were games that demanded hundreds of hours to master, which is not exactly the most appealing to the more casual audience, surely. And so the results of this? Well, the games actually sold decently well. Inside Japan, that is, where players seemed to be more willing to wade through the mud to get to the fun parts. The rest of the world, though? Monster Hunter had done well enough capturing a Japanese audience, but really struggled to gain popularity anywhere else. It was enough for the game developers to continue making the game, so certainly the franchise was successful, but it was far from worldwide mainstream success. Flesh and Blood is currently in a similar but also opposite situation. See, the games have a dedicated fan base that's not insanely huge, but likely a lot larger than most of us realize. See, if you lived outside of Japan, the Monster Hunter fan base probably looked very tiny back in the day. And if there's no game stores around you carrying Flesh and Blood, then it's probably easy to think the same. The difference here is that instead of being localized in a single country, Flesh and Blood is scattered all over the world. The game is sold in over 4,000 stores across nearly 50 countries. This makes for a sizable player base that just feels smaller since it's so spread out. Even here in Canada, there are several stores within an hour drive for me, but I also know of cities just a couple hours away where no stores carry the game. So, much like Monster Hunter, the game has done well enough to support the business, but it seems to be falling short of that mainstream success that other TCGs, namely Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic, have attained. And, according to the arguments we're suspending our disbelief for, this is due to its inability to attract casual players. The difference between casual and hardcore players is, at its essence, a question of how much time and energy someone wants to devote to a game. And the best games are those that can walk the line between them, offering a fun casual experience while also having a large amount of depth to them, which the more hardcore types can sink their teeth into. I think the best example of this is Super Smash Bros., where most people just play it at their family function with items on and no one really knows what they're doing. At the same time, you also have a super competitive side of things for those who want to master the game. Now, I would like to make the argument that Flesh and Blood actually walks this line decently well. Of course, if casuals show up the LGS, they're going to get decimated, but I don't think that a group of at-home players really care about getting super good at the game, so the casual space there remains intact. Old school Monster Hunter games, however, were very anti-casual because everything just took so much time to do. And even once you finally grinded enough to face the next big monster, you'd have to fight it several times because you'd just keep getting your butt kicked. However, despite Monster Hunter being a difficult, more hardcore series, that didn't stop it from breaking into the mainstream casual player base. Because what happens when a series like this finally comes out with a game that streamlines the experience and makes it more accessible and appealing to casual crowds? You get Monster Hunter World, the most popular game in the series by far. This game and its expansion Iceborne sold almost as much as all of the previous games in the series combined, and it sold more worldwide than it did in Japan for the first time ever. Here's the thing though, Monster Hunter World released a whole 14 years after the first game. For all of that time, these games were still pretty niche, especially on the worldwide stage, and most people playing it never expected the games to be this popular. Monster Hunter fans were super dedicated and loved the games even with all of the tedium. But all it took was removing that, making it look a little more appealing to a wider audience, and all of a sudden you had a wildly popular game that launched the franchise into the mainstream. It took a very long time, but they had achieved what many of us back in the day thought would never happen. And Flesh and Blood, well, it's no question that the game is incredible to play and has a very dedicated fan base and is doing well financially. They've just upped the competitive pricing from 1 million to 1.5 million for 2024. They've just moved into a new headquarters, and according to Deloitte, Legend Story Studios, the company making the game, had grown 6,416% in 2022. So even if that growth has drastically slowed, I'd say they're doing just fine. Much like how Monster Hunter continued on for 14 years with a smaller dedicated audience, Flesh and Blood, even if it is struggling to get casual players, could very well do the same. But how could they gain casual players with such a competitive based game? Well, Flesh and Blood does have Ultimate Pit Fight, the casual multiplayer format, but it's not as popular with the core player base, and it also has to compete with Magic the Gathering's Commander format. However, there is another style of play that's been teased by the company, although we have no idea when it will release or even what it will look like when it finally does. That's right, I'm talking about PvE. Players versus environment is a style of play that no other big trading card game really has or even can do. Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Don't really lend themselves well to multiplayer, and Magic has so many infinite combos that this type of system would have to be too restrictive on card options. So that leaves the door open for Flesh and Blood to really dominate this market with this style of play, if they do it right and it's actually really fun to play. The mechanics of back and forth combat and the limits of hero intellect lend itself really well to a PvE system. And whether it's a D&D style of campaign or fighting bosses, it would be so much fun to roleplay as your favorite hero with this sort of experience. PvE would be perfect for having casual players join in at the LGS with the hardcore players, since they'd be on the same team rather than facing each other. Again though, we don't really know when PvE will release. The team making Flesh and Blood is still somewhat small, especially for a global game, and so it could be a year or 2 or 5 or even more. But if Monster Hunter has demonstrated anything, it's that as long as the company is profitable enough, they have the time to hone their craft, make some changes and tweaks, and perfect the formula to make their game far more accessible to a casual audience. And I think LSS is capable of this, whether it's with fixing the broken power levels of the game, adjusting marvels after some lackluster ones, or just straight up admitting when they make mistakes. The team behind this game are always adjusting, learning, and genuinely attempting to make the best game they possibly can. So even if the claims that casual players won't play the game because they lose at the LGS is true, it's not going to matter in the long term because the company isn't about to go bankrupt anytime soon. I mean, we've already got the game printed in English, French, German, Italian, and Spanish, with Japanese coming in the very next set after heavy hitters. There are more than enough players all over the world for this game to continue to be produced for many more years. In 10 years, the game will be far bigger than it is now, and I hope that you'll all still be here, and that I'm still here, still making content, and still using Mr. Ribbits as a gag character in my videos. Yeah, actually, about that, can you please give me more roles in your videos again? I need to feed my starving children! And a huge thanks once again to Into the AM for sponsoring this video. Use my link intotheam.com/sloopdoop to get 10% off your entire order. You guys should actually check them out. This stuff is really, really nice. Thank you very much. And thanks again to the patrons, because apparently that's the only thing I'm good for. Anyways, we've got the Giga Chad Saint, Geeks First, Elixir, Smokeopotamus, John, Ty, James, Chemical, Bryant, Transient Fire, Dark Memoria, and Big Hungry. Then we've got the Alpha Chads Thomas and Zajima, and the Super Chads Bruno, Thal, Cece, Eric, Ben, and Yogbadoodles21. Thanks again as always, and stay chadly, my friends.